Joe Rogan has recently intensified his criticism of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, labeling him as a dictator and a sketchy guy during a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. Rogan, along with his guest, comedian Tom Segura, expressed their discontent with Trudeau's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Canadian government's policies, particularly those related to free speech and civil liberties.
Because when you think about it, if this is true and if these people are compromised because they're secretly perverts and creeps.
They are, though.
And they're corrupt and they steal money or all these different things are evil things.
Rogan's disdain for Trudeau has been brewing for some time, but his recent remarks were particularly harsh. He condemned the Prime Minister's response to the Freedom Convoy protests, which saw Canadian truckers demonstrating against COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Rogan criticized Trudeau for enacting the Emergencies Act to disband the protests, which included freezing the bank accounts of those involved or supporting the truckers financially. Rogan argued that such actions were draconian and likened them to those of a totalitarian regime. Additionally, Rogan took issue with Canada's hate speech laws, which he believes infringe on free speech. He expressed his concerns that the Canadian government, under Trudeau's leadership, has too much power to silence dissent and punish individuals for their opinions. These criticisms are part of a broader dialogue Rogan has maintained on his podcast about the erosion of civil liberties and the overreach of governmental power.
Canada has ridiculous free speech laws. They have hate speech laws. They can come down on you for a lot of things.
Despite admitting his limited understanding of Canadian politics, Rogan didn't hold back in his condemnation, calling Canada a communist country under Trudeau's administration. He reflected on how his perception of Trudeau shifted dramatically from seeing him as a charismatic leader to viewing him as an authoritarian figure during the pandemic. Rogan's transformation in perception underscores his growing concerns about government overreach and the suppression of individual freedoms.
They're in the middle of a full-blown communist takeover. Yeah, it's a scary spot.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yes.
Rogan's criticisms also included Trudeau's approach to managing the COVID-19 pandemic, which he views as excessively authoritarian. He further accused Trudeau of using the pandemic as an excuse to consolidate power and suppress dissent. Now, this perspective aligns with Rogan's broader skepticism of governmental responses to the pandemic, which he often discusses on his podcast. He's also recently voiced concerns about lockdown measures, vaccine mandates, and other public health policies that he believes infringe on personal freedoms. The Freedom Convoy protests marked a significant moment in Canadian politics and drew international attention as well. Thousands of truckers and their supporters took to the streets to protest vaccine mandates and other COVID-19 restrictions. The protests culminated in a blockade of Ottawa, the nation's capital, which lasted for several weeks. The Canadian government's response, particularly the use of the Emergencies Act, was seen by many, including Rogan, as an overreach of executive power.
Ridiculous free speech laws. They have hate speech laws. They can come down on you for a lot of things. They seized up the bank accounts of people that were protesting the truckers.
Oh, that was a fun
the
time.
truckers, the people that were donating to the truckers, they seized their bank accounts.
Rogan's condemnation of Trudeau's actions during the protest reflects a broader critique of how governments worldwide have handled dissent during the pandemic. By freezing bank accounts and deploying emergency powers, Trudeau's administration aimed to quell the protest and restore order. However, critics argue that such measures were disproportionate and undermined the democratic rights of citizens to protest and express their grievances.
That's not a good place.
Yeah.
It's not a good place under this administration, at least.
One of the central points of Rogan's criticism is Canada's hate speech laws. Under Canadian law, hate speech is a criminal offense and individuals can be prosecuted for promoting hate against identifiable groups. Rogan argues that these laws are overly broad and can be used to stifle legitimate criticism and dissent. He believes that such laws give the government too much power to regulate speech and punish individuals for expressing controversial or unpopular opinions.
Beautiful
I don't go to
cities.
Canada anymore. But
Ever?
No.
Don't do a gig there?
No, not while that guy's president. Fuck you.
Yeah,
or
but
whatever he is, Prime
these people
Minister.
are fans of yours. They want to see you.
You, get rid of that guy. I'll come back. I just don't trust any of it up there.
Yeah.
Rogan's concerns about free speech aren't unique to Canada. He's often spoken out against what he perceives as growing censorship and the suppression of free expression in many Western democracies. He argues that the ability to speak freely and criticize the government is a fundamental right that must be protected, even if the speech in question is offensive or controversial. In his view, Canada's hate speech laws represent a dangerous precedent that other countries might follow, leading to a broader erosion of free speech rights. Rogan's critique of Trudeau extends beyond the specific issues of the Freedom Convoy and hate speech laws. He sees these actions as part of a broader trend towards authoritarianism in Canada. He argues that Trudeau's government has used the pandemic as an excuse to expand its power and control over citizens' lives. This perspective is shared by many who are concerned about the long-term implications of pandemic-related policies on civil liberties and democratic governance.
Into tyranny right now, like the laws that they're passing, the shit that they're doing, the erosion of people's rights, like I don't want to support it. I think it's fucking horrible.
In addition to the specific policies that he criticizes, Rogan also questions Trudeau's character and motivations. He describes the Prime Minister as a sketchy guy with shaky deals, suggesting that Trudeau's actions are driven by a desire to consolidate power and suppress opposition, rather than genuine concern for public health and safety. While these accusations are largely speculative, they reflect a deep mistrust of political leaders and institutions that's common among Rogan's audience.
Full-blown communist takeover. Yeah, it's a scary spot.
Yeah.
It's scary. But it used to be amazing. I used to say that Canada's 20% less douchebags.
Joe Rogan's podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, is one of the most popular podcasts globally, with millions of listeners. His opinions and critiques carry significant weight, particularly among his predominantly young male audience. Rogan's criticisms of Trudeau are likely to resonate with those who share his concerns about government overreach and the suppression of free speech. However, they also attract backlash from those who support Trudeau's policies and believe that the government's actions during the pandemic were necessary and justified. The public reception of Rogan's comments highlights the polarized nature of contemporary political discourse. On the one hand, supporters of Rogan see him as a champion of free speech and individual liberties, speaking truth to power and challenging authoritarianism. On the other hand, critics view him as a provocateur who spreads misinformation and undermines trust in public institutions. This polarization reflects broader social divisions over issues such as pandemic responses, civil liberties, and the role of government in regulating speech and behavior. Rogan's concerns about governmental overreach and suppression of dissent are not isolated to Canada. Similar debates are occurring globally as governments grapple with balancing public health measures against individual freedoms. For instance, in the United States, debates about free speech, governmental authority, and pandemic responses have been highly contentious. Policies such as mask mandates, lockdowns, and vaccine requirements have sparked significant controversy, with critics arguing that these measures infringe on personal liberties.
The people with guns, and they tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And then you have violence that is enforced to get people to follow a doctrine.
Rogan's commentary often draws parallels between different countries' approaches to handling the pandemic and other crises, highlighting what he sees as a global trend toward authoritarianism. By using his platform to criticize leaders like Trudeau, Rogan aims to raise awareness about these issues and advocate for the protection of individual freedoms. His influence extends beyond his immediate audience, contributing to broader discussions about governance, civil liberties, and the role of the state in times of crisis. His recent criticisms of Trudeau encapsulate a broader debate about government power, free speech, and civil liberties in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rogan's portrayal of Trudeau as a dictator and his condemnation of Canada's hate speech laws highlight concerns about the potential for government overreach and the suppression of dissent. These criticisms resonate with many who share Rogan's libertarian values and skepticism of government authority.
Yeah, where do you go?
They went sideways. Canada was an amazing place 10 years ago.
At the same time, Rogan's comments also attracted significant backlash from those who support Trudeau's policies and views them as necessary measures to protect public health and maintain social order. The polarized reception of Rogan's remarks underscores the deep divisions within society over how best to balance individual freedoms with collective responsibility and public safety. As Rogan continues to use his platform to challenge political leaders and advocate for free speech, his influence on public discourse remains significant. Whether one agrees with his views or not, Rogan's willingness to speak out on controversial issues ensures that debates about government power, free speech, and civil liberties will continue to be a central part of the public conversation.